here we've thought recessions. They've been predicting a recession for the last 3 years. 4 or 5 years. I think everything between really the next 90 days and where you want to be, keep your eye on the prize. That's the idea. The big, hairy, audacious goal is to keep your eye on the prize. But then you've got to be willing to go with the changes of the winds.
Put that coffee down.
Creators are leaders. Be careful what kind of leaders you're producing here.
Helen, we're both in sales.
Let me tell you why I suck as a salesman.
They realized that to be in power, you didn't need guns or money or even numbers. You just needed the will to do what the other guy wouldn't.
I'm not leaving. The show goes on.
Well, hello there, friend. Welcome back to the Construction Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Bradley Hartman. Well, friends, I'm excited to bring to you today our 400th episode, and I'm not really good at celebrating milestones like this. However, we went through quite some effort to really get an amazing guest, and Mr. Verne Harnish, I'm thrilled to announce, is our guest on this episode, and you, I can promise, are going to learn a lot from him. But before I jump into this episode, I want to give a quick plug to our third cohort. We are opening up registration for the OSR Academy Year 3. And the second week of June, we are opening up registration. So if you are interested in that, it's our 12-month online, offline program that includes our 2-day sales fundamentals workshop that is held every April in Fort Worth. It's included in there. Our goal is to enroll your student into your own personal sales farm system so we can help you develop your next MVP. Now, based on the companies that have had students in our program from cohort 1 and cohort 2, we've sold out about half the seats of the 35 that we are targeting. So if you are interested, number one, you can just continue to listen. We're going to share more details. If you just Google OSR Academy, that will come up. But it's a full program to really address goal setting and prospecting and negotiation, overcoming objections, all the tools salespeople will need to be successful in the construction industry. We cover it over a year. We learn from each other. There's online training. We bring all sorts of fantastic sales trainers and builders so we can teach these talented salespeople how to do their job better, deliver value first, and not fall into some of these potholes that so many salespeople fall into. So that's coming up here the second week of June. And I bring this up because I used one of the frameworks that we used in the OSR Academy in term 2 when we talk about prospecting, and we call it the RRI framework. And it stands for referral, research, and insight. And if you're going to reach out to someone who doesn't know you, like Verne didn't know me, if you present a referral, you include some research, and show that you have an idea or an insight, you are positioning yourself different from all the other people who are trying to interrupt him to take his time. So how did I do that? The first part was share with a good friend who you will hear about during the episode, Mr. Jim Sobeck, who about a year and a half ago or so sold New South Construction Supply. And Jim has been a mentor, a friend, and a client, sometimes all three of them. And he learned, because I told him, that Verne was at the very top of our list. Like, I've been reading his stuff, whether it was Scaling Up, Mastering the Rockefeller Habits 2.0, or also his other book that I love is The Greatest Business Decisions of All Time. And Jim said, oh, I know Verne. I can reach out to you on his behalf. So there was the referral. The research was, well, that was pretty easy because I have been reading his stuff. I've also read numerous articles. I've been on Verne Harnish's newsletter for years. So that was really easy to prove that I wasn't just dialing for dollars, that I've gotten a lot of value and I know his content well. So hopefully we are going to have a unique and different podcast conversation. So it wasn't just another 40 minutes of deja vu for him. And the idea or insight was really understanding what he was trying to do with his organization and really hoping that we could connect with people like you to deliver value, to see if you'd be a fit for his scaling up content. So there it is, the RRI framework. This is just one of the frameworks that we present and coach up in the OSR Academy. So you can see these things are vetted in the real world and actively help me sell more to bring people like Verne Harnish to you. So who is Mr. Verne Harnish and why did I want him on the show? He's the founder of the world-renowned Entrepreneurs Organization, also known as EO, with over 18,000 members worldwide. And he has chaired for 15 years EO's premier CEO program held at MIT, that would be the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a program in which he still teaches today. Verne has spent the last 4 decades helping companies scale up. He's the author of the bestseller, Mastering the Rockefeller Habits, which I would strongly recommend to a friend, which has been translated into 26 languages and has won 8 major international book awards. And I think we all track the International Book Awards very closely. So there's that. And 12 Habits of Valuable Employees rocketed to #1 HR books on Amazon. A private investor in many scale-ups, Verne enjoys piano, tennis, and magic as a card-carrying member of the International Brotherhood of Magicians. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Did I want to ask Verne about his magician skills? Hell yes, I did. However, this came up with our recent episode with our friend Tom Asacker, who knows Verne Harnish. So, out of courtesy to you, my dear listener, I didn't want you to think that I was just like going to the International Brotherhood of Magicians and trying to figure out which one of these people would come on the podcast. I wasn't doing that. This is a coincidence. All right, let's keep this moving. I'm rambling. Friends, this is officially episode number 400. Whether this is your first episode you've listened to or number 400, like you and my mom, then thank you. And we are going to continue to try to work hard to earn your attention and make sure that we're delivering the best product to help you become better leader and manager. As always, thank you for listening. So Mr. Verne Harnish, welcome to the show.
Bradley, hey, it has been a while. You got hit in the head with a baseball. I had a conflict. I mean, this thing has been months in the making. But anyway, I'm glad to be on and looking forward to hitting it hard right away.
Yes, you and our audience will be able to determine if the concussion that I sustained impacted me into this moment. But let's jump right in. I want to ask about the Rockefeller Habits. And what was that moment of insight? Because you list your 10 and I read through these. I'm like, yeah, here it all is. And I'm wondering, how did you read a biography? What was the moment of insight that led to you really focusing on these 10 Rockefeller Habits?
Well, the initial was I founded the Entrepreneurs Organization, and I felt it needed an executive program like YPO has at Harvard. Harvard turned us down, so I went next door to MIT, and in 91 launched this program today called EMP, Entrepreneurial Masters Program. We just had our reunion class over the weekend, and there wasn't really a parenting manual for how to grow up a company. There's a lot of information on startups, an incubator on every corner. I've got an MBA. It's supposed to teach you how to run a big company, but there wasn't that parenting manual. So what really led up to mastering the Rockefeller Habits, Bradley, was 10 years of moving about 1,000 CEOs, running real companies through that program over it was a 3-year program. And it let me bring in all of the thought leaders that I highlight in scaling up. I mean, I hardly have all the answers. I highlight 40 different other thought leaders in that book. And it allowed us to put together a framework that led to what is our Rockefeller Habits checklist. Now, the branding came from then reading the biography on John D. Rockefeller, and he launched, when he was 16. I've been beating on my own 16-year-old. Hey, just drop out of school and get started, School doesn't like him anyway. And it was clear that what I had discovered over those 10 years were at the heart of those mid-market companies scaling the best, had also been at the heart of what John D. Rockefeller and his consultants had discovered 100 years before. And so I just thought it was a good moniker at the time. He was the wealthiest person ever in history. I think he still holds that as a percent of GDP, even if you've got Elon Musk and others up there at the top. So, but it was 10 years of real practical research in the field, in the trenches, having real companies like Jim Sobeck, who's been on your show, put these practices in place, which he started in 1995, way before I released the book in 2002.
Yeah, you highlight so many different sources and different people that impacted you. We're going to hit on books later, but maybe that's something that you can hit on here with a different question. I want to know, you imagine the Verne Harnish Mount Rushmore of, in parentheses, non-obvious leaders. So I'm going to take a few of them off the table for you. You don't get Abe Lincoln. You don't get Steve Jobs. No Jim Collins. No Jack Welch. No Peter Drucker. So you don't get those guys, but you get anyone else. What are those four faces that are up there for you?
All right. Well, first of all, and this could be for another conversation, I think Abe Lincoln's the worst president we ever had in history. And everybody thinks he was number one. So we're going to set that aside. You didn't even bring his name up when you gave that book initially. But I would put number one, the French CEO, Hubert Joly. He's now at Harvard. He teaches in our CEO Summit we host at Harvard. And he is the CEO that turned around Best Buy.
Yes.
I mean, at a time when Circuit City had just failed, which really put kind of a chink in Jim Collins' brand.
A little bit.
Amazon came on strong. And he didn't need to risk his reputation, yet he took the valuation of that company from $11 to $110. And look, that's the number one job of an owner of a business, is driving valuation. Their number one decision is who should be CEO. And sometimes their listeners are both, and maybe they need to fire themselves as CEO. But the number one job is to drive valuation. And he wrote a book that I named number one when it came out a couple of years ago. I literally highlighted every sentence in the book, and it's called The Heart of Business. And he shared something interesting, which is that Jim Clifton, CEO of Gallup, has said it's time to get rid of managers. Nobody wants managed. I know none of my 4 children want a manager. That's why that middle layer is getting cleaned out in companies all over the world. But he's not sure people even want leadership. He said a better word is careship. You know, at the end of the day, if your people will care for your customers and care for you and your company, if they know that you care for them. And so Hubert Joly's and his book, The Heart of Business. I'd put number 2, Dr. Robert Cialdini. He is the godfather of influence. Mm-hmm. And his book, Influence, which he updated 2 years ago, he added a 7th influencer. Look, that's the business we're in, is influencing people to buy from us, work from us, invest in us, pay attention to us. And particularly his teachings around pricing. You know, pricing, particularly in this environment that we're in right now, is critical because of inflation. It's here. You know, it's why the stock market took a big hit a few weeks ago, and it's expected to be with us this whole decade. And if people are not careful with their pricing and comp, the book we wrote on compensation, which is pricing internally, you're going to wake up, and a lot of companies did at the end of 2023, and their margins were gone. And so Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, and his Persuasion book, which leads me to number 3 on the Mount Rushmore, and he's my mentor. I've learned so much from him, and that is Hermann Simon, Dr. Hermann Simon. He's the Peter Drucker of Europe. In fact, he was invited to keynote the 100th anniversary of Peter Drucker's death. And he wrote 2 critical books. One, Hidden Champions of the 21st Century. He really studied us, these family-owned, privately held companies that go on. And the idea is that the riches are in the niches. Mm-hmm. And I can give you an example there. But his book, Hidden Champions, the 21st Century, and then he is the hidden champion of pricing. His global pricing firm, and Simon Kucher, does over $500 million a year in pricing consultancy. And the clients that we've brought him in on, I mean, we have a client that was running 13 million EBITDA, went to 54 million in 1 year. And they're selling a commodity product because they got pricing right inside the organization. And so I would put him number 3. And then and they're all dear friends. And then my dear friend, Aubrey Daniels, Aubrey, adjunct professor at Harvard, he wrote a book called Bringing Out the Best in People. And look, at the end of the day, everyone thinks, yeah, but our industry is different. Well, but at the end of the day, it's just about getting people to get stuff done. Mm-hmm. And the ability to bring out the best in people, I think, is critical. So those would be the four. I feel bad I haven't mentioned a woman, seriously, on that list. And I'm sitting there thinking who that would be. We just hosted Ginny Rometty, the former CEO of IBM. Oh, yeah. Her book, Good Power, it was a great interview and all of that. So I enjoyed her. Sheryl Sandberg and what she did to really mentor Mark Zuckerberg, I think is absolutely critical. So I think I'm remiss in not having one of those four be a woman. I'll think about that by the end of the broadcast.
Sure. You said something on a podcast and on the Scaling Up podcast that it just punched me in the gut, similar to the very contrarian view that Abe Lincoln is not a good leader, which is hilarious. And I love, because you've said a handful of things. We're not going to be able to cover them all, but where you're saying everybody says this, here's my take. And it's the opposite. I'm like, yes, give me a different perspective. But I kind of labeled it kind of the barbell goal setting strategy, where you said, you want to set your BHAG, your big, hairy, audacious goal for the future. Like, let's know where we're going there. And also, we need to plan for the next 12 months. In between, no one knows. Embrace serendipity. And when I heard you say that, I rewound the thing like 6 times and listened to it over and over again. I think it was from 2023. I could be wrong. But can you go into that just a little bit? Because that is a contrarian view on kind of goal setting, at least from the people that I'm thinking about or how I'm going about it.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Who had in their 2023 plan AI? Mm-hmm. Or I can't remember when did ChatGPT launch? Was it 22 or 21? Maybe I'm wrong the year. Yeah. And all of a sudden, I know when all of a sudden it came on the scene, I mean, everybody was changing plans and making pivots. And if you weren't, if you haven't figured out a way to implement AI as an extra employee and assistant to all the rest of your employees, you're going to get left behind by the competitors who do. And here we've thought recessions. They've been predicting a recession for the last 3 years. 4 or 5 years. I think everything between really the next 90 days and where you want to be, keep your eye on the prize. That's the idea. The big, hairy, audacious goal is to keep your eye on the prize. But then you've got to be willing to go with the changes of the winds. And it's like sailing. I used to race when I was in college. And, the key is to keep your eye on the point where you're headed. And then it's a constant adjustment, of course, based on what's happening with the winds and the currents and all of that. And I think everything else in between that is a wild ankle guess. That's why I think there's really 2 points you need to be confident about: where you're going and what we've got to do really today, the sprint this week, maybe the theme for the quarter or the year, but the rest, we got to see what's going to come up next.
Well, I enjoyed that because I shut off the podcast and I started just thinking about like the most exciting things or the opportunities or the people that we've worked with over the last couple of years that like gave me the most energy and enthusiasm, and not coincidentally, biggest opportunity in the business. They were all largely due to serendipity, or things just came out. There was no plan for them. They weren't on my target list. They weren't on my top 25. They just happened. Yeah. And it almost gave me like a sense of relief. Like, okay, because if someone says, how strongly do you feel about your next 3-year plan? I'm like, well, I have one. I'm going to work my tail off, but I don't know. Right. So it gave me a sense of relief. So I appreciate that sentiment.
You bet.
Let me ask you this. We have a handful of clients that they've scaled up at least once or twice, and they are now in the several $100 million range, and they have reached a ceiling of complexity as they kind of look at going to maybe 350, 400, or $500 million. There's a lot of consolidation that's going on in construction and lumber building materials. Are the scaling up model and kind of the people, strategy, execution, cash that you talk about in your book, which everyone should own. It should be a reference tool they use often. Does that change if they've already 10x'd once or twice in their career?
Well, first of all, a couple of points. I brought back my original book, Mastering the Rockefeller Habits, 22nd anniversary edition, a couple of weeks ago. It's a much simpler read than Scaling Up. Scaling Up really is the master class.
Okay.
And so anyone who's getting started, and if you want a book for your employees to read, so you can get everybody on the same page, and that's what's critical, is to create kind of a common language and platform, performance platform throughout the organization. But none of the stuff we do, we make up. A lot of our competitors want to make up some new framework. This idea of people, strategy, execution, and cash align with what, for instance, Hubert Joly says are the top 4 jobs then of a CEO. It's what IDEO, who's launched 100 companies and funded 100 other, said are the 4 areas that they look at and focus on as they're scaling. And it aligns with Jim Collins. You got to have disciplined people engaged in disciplined thought strategy through disciplined execution or action. And then later on in his book, Great by Choice, he added cash because growth sucks cash. And he had a whole chapter on return on luck and the importance of cash. And so our framework, people, strategy, execution, cash, isn't something we made up. It really is rooted in, the top thinkers like Michael Porter at Harvard and others. And so, yes, all 4 of those areas are applicable at massive scale as they are from startup. And what IDEO's research found is when they looked at which of the 4 matters most, I love when research comes back with answers you're not expecting. First, all 4 matter equally. It's like a 4-legged table. If one's weak, it's at risk. But they did find a 5th. And I went back because I self-published and edited our book. I'm always learning myself. And it was market timing. At the end of the day, the market makes you look smart or makes you look dumb. One of the questions, Bradley, I ask my audiences is I say, hey, how many of you have a friend that is dumber than you, but has done much better than you? You'll be at industry trade events and you're like, wait a second, how did that dude, pull that off? And you got to realize it's dumb to fight the winds of the market. And that's part of why you've got to have your real ear to the ground. And the most important thing is the CEO has to be in the factory, has to be on site with customers. You cannot delegate this. Ginny Rometty emphasized it. And maybe I'll give 3 examples lately. So my good friend David Risher is the new CEO of Lyft, the competitor to Uber. In fact, just a couple of days ago, he celebrated the 1-year anniversary. They had his name up big on the NASDAQ board in Times Square. And the first thing he did 3 days in is get certified to drive. And he drives every Sunday. Now, let's speed forward a few months. One of the things that he discovered is that, wait a second, women would really like to have the opportunity to choose a woman driver. It's like, duh. Right? All these insights are obvious in hindsight. And so he's really gone all in around safety for women and becoming really the preferred, Lyft for women. And by the way, his stock's up 60%. There's a measure in just 1 year. He's been able to pop valuation. Brian Chesky, I know Nate, his co-founder, but Brian could not figure out why Airbnb was stuck. And so he spent 6 months working out of Airbnbs and he found it. He found the one thing, made that change beginning of 2023. And I don't know if you saw, their revenue jumped so much, they became one of the newest Fortune 500 companies. And then Laxman, who's the new CEO of Starbucks, for the first 6 months, he worked as a barista all over the world. And what I love is he announced November, I think, 22nd, 23, what the go-forward plan is for 2024 and beyond. And here's a key message. You don't have a strategy. And your number one job as CEO is to set strategy. We can cover the other three, but the number one, that's Michael Porter, that's Hubert Joly, that's not Verne Harnish making this stuff up. Your number one job is strategy. And as Hubert said, you don't have a strategy if you haven't named it. You know, I've been encouraging people to go back to Top Gun Maverick. And I asked the question, what was the name of the mission in Top Gun Maverick? And it was Dagger. You got to put a dagger at the heart of that uranium enrichment facility. And as a result, the 4 teams were called Dagger 1, Dagger 2, Dagger 3, Dagger 4. And so Laxman at least named their go-forward strategy, called it the triple shot reinvention strategy. So, a kind of play on being Starbucks. And he laid out just what are the 3 things they've got to do between now and 2030. That's kind of his go forward. And clearly the goal is to dramatically increase the valuation of Starbucks. So hopefully there's some lessons in there for your listeners. By the way, if it's interesting, the other 3 jobs of a CEO then, their number one is set strategy. And I know Jim Collins said you got to put people ahead of strategy, but once you have a team, if you don't know your strategy, then it's hard, number 2, to know who should be your senior team. And that is your second decision. We have a tool called FACE that helps you get that right. Function accountability chart. The third job is culture. And by the way, as Drucker said, culture eats strategy for lunch. I don't know if it does, but that really is execution, critical to execution. And then the fourth main job is your ability to allocate capital and use capital properly, as Jim Sobeck did. Jim Sobeck, utilized a tremendous amount of debt. And the article that you're going to point people to even talk about how he then got himself off those personal guarantees. But without his clever use of capital, he couldn't have gotten his building products company from 10 million to 100 million and exit. And so those 4, strategy, senior team, people, culture for execution, and capital allocation, align with people, strategy, execution, and cash.
Yep. Well, you had me thinking about a transgression of the law that you just cited 3 people who did, but there's this new article in Fortune magazine about Boeing's troubles.
Yes.
And they said the big profit center where all the talent was in, I believe, Everett, Washington. And then they moved almost all senior leadership to Chicago. So halfway across the country. And then they moved it to DC. And they said they really separated senior talent from being on the ground closest to the quality.
Yeah.
So
and there's one more thing I would highlight there that I think is an important lesson for all of the listeners. And I take this from Tom Peters, one of my great early mentors, endorsed the front of my first book, retired recently. Tom said you can outsource everything. And I do think you can outsource lots, except your soul. You can't outsource the soul. And so let's take Apple. Sorry, I'm bringing up Steve Jobs. It wouldn't be a Verne Harnish broadcast without my love for, the lessons from Steve and obviously Elon Musk. I hope everyone's read the latest biography on Elon. I'm going through it for a 3rd time. But Apple outsourced, for instance, the manufacturing of their phones. But they didn't outsource design. That's always been the soul. And I think Apple's done great up until about 3 years ago now, Johnny Ive left. And I think that's why they're in trouble here. And all of a sudden now Samsung has jumped ahead of them with phones and all of that. And so I think Boeing, and that's why they're trying to bring it back in-house, they outsourced the soul of their business, which is the actual manufacturing of the components that are critical and the assembly of those components. And so I'm glad they're bringing that in-house. And that you can't also outsource engineering. And that's why I hope they get a CEO who's got a strong engineering background. Their last 2 have all been financial backgrounds. And I think that's why we're seeing the trouble that we are.
Yeah, that was a big takeaway for me is the stark difference between expertise on financial engineering and actual engineering when the core product and value deliver is that engineering. That really stood out. Verne, you mentioned, I think you'll correct me here, the functional accountability tool. Is that correct?
Yeah. Our function accountability chart. And then we have a process accountability chart. So you got to get the functions and the process right. And I'll just say one thing there.
Sure.
The big challenge, particularly as you said, 100 million up to $1 billion, is we get too siloed, too stovepiped. We're so focused on running great accounting, and HR and IT and marketing. We forget that the customer experience and the employee experience, CX plus EX equals SX, not sex, but shareholder experience, which is sexy, is the processes that cut across those functions. Those are really the value drivers. And I saw that in how Chick-fil-A is structured at their headquarters, much different than what most Fortune 500 companies and large companies are structured. So the key is to make sure that you're really focused on as much our process accountability chart or the value drivers as you are getting the functions right. Otherwise, you end up with this kind of stovepiped organization.
I wanted to ask you, going through your book, by the way, the amount of tools that you make freely available for someone who buys the book and then can just put these together and watch videos. There's so much content out there. It seemed to me that you and your team, some combination of that, you have a gift for taking an idea, an article, converting it into a framework, making a template that people use and they say, oh my gosh, yes, this is extremely helpful for me to think about my own thinking and then execute. Is that a replicable skill, or is this just something that is kind of part of someone's unique ability, maybe yours, because the value you provide just in these kind of templates to help other people, whether it's plug and play, it's just a tremendous amount of value. I'm curious if you had tips on that for other folks.
Well, Bradley, thank you. That's all I can say there. Dan Sullivan's the guy who gets credit for the whole unique ability idea. And it does seem to be one of the things I'm able to do.
Okay.
Is take a whole bunch of complex multi-books and bring it together in a way that, our mid-market companies can actually put these to use. And that was just through putting in my 10,000 hours in that executive program I launched for EO that still runs today. And they still let the old man come back and teach in it, once a year. So
that's nice of them to allow you to do so.
Yes. Well, and I think a key book there is Arthur Brooks' Strength to Strength. And he points out that we have a different intelligence when we're younger. I think he called it fluid intelligence. And then we have a different intelligence as we get older, which is our ability to synthesize. And I think that name of that intelligence is something like synthetic or whatever. And so that's one of the gifts that I think we all get with experience. And it's one of the reasons why, and it's my second article I wrote for Fortune magazine back in, I think, 2001, 2002, is that we have success in one industry and then we think we can port that to another industry and we get our heads handed to us. I've seen so many serial entrepreneurs, lose a big chunk of their net worth in their second and third venture if they don't stick to their knitting and understanding. So
you mentioned in one of your emails this idea of I feel like this is spreading, it's accelerating with business owners or business leaders referring to themselves very candidly, without a smirk on their face, as visionaries is something that just drives me crazy. Someone's like, oh, are you a visionary? I'm like, I don't know what I am. I'm not that. I can't name you that. You mentioned Abe Lincoln. Are there other contrarian perspectives you have where you're like, I hear everybody saying this and it drives me crazy? What else might be on your short list there, Verne?
Yeah. Well, first of all, is the term visionary. I mean, I really pray that none of the listeners here ever stand up in front of their audience, their team, and hold their hands out and declare themselves a visionary. I think that's both a little creepy and egotistical. And by the way, it's not accurate.
Yeah.
Yes, the CEO has to set vision. Mm-hmm. And vision's one of your jobs as the strategist. So the term that we actually use, which we feel is more accurate, we really work hard to be accurate here and not pop psychology like. And that is that you are the strategist. And then the other term running around is integrator. And one of the reasons I use Google's images to give me a sense of what the crowd feels like that word means. An integrator, all it pops up are integrated circuits. Mm-hmm. We use the term orchestrator instead. Really, then your orchestrator's job is to bring on a great group of A-player musicians, choose the music that you as the strategist have set. Mozart was the strategist. Then that orchestrator sets the rhythm, the meeting rhythm, and executes through the culture of that orchestra some beautiful music instead of just a bunch of noise. And so one of the things I hate about our industry is that we don't agree on the language. I mean, could you imagine if doctors fought over what we ought to call a femur? Just because they want to make a name for themselves, we're going to call the femur something else. It would be disastrous. Yet that's what we do in our industry. So we've worked hard to give credit where credit's due and find what are the proven practices, not made up practices, in order to drive things forward. So that's one of them that I maybe is contrary, in addition to thinking Abe Lincoln's the worst president we've ever had. By the way, I should explain that. It's a very simple KPI. It's a very simple KPI. More Americans died under his leadership than all the other presidents in the history of our country combined.
Is that right?
And that was the North should have won that in 6 months, but because he was such an inept leader himself. And Doris Kearns, who wrote the book, A Team of Rivals, that's where I picked it up. She didn't want to say it, but the undercurrents of everything she researched is like, this guy is an idiot, and he caused the loss. Now, I'm not speaking for Doris, but I read between the lines that this guy, and by the way, the cotton gin was going to be kind of putting that part of the industry out of business. I think it was going to change anyway. Long story short, I think one KPI, how many Americans died under your watch, is a critical KPI. And that's why I put him last.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm so glad this came up. I'm so glad.
I don't know. I'm going to get a lot of hate mail. We'll see what happens. Please don't hate on me. Allow
me, if I can, to lie down on your business therapy couch here for a minute. I've been delaying it for so long. And, it's one thing to like read the advice in here and be like, 100% totally agree. Anyone in my position that I was advising, pretty obvious. It's taken me way too long to take off my founder/salesperson hat and hire someone else and trust them to go out to sell our wares in the market. Any advice for a founder who loves to sell, who knows for the company to grow, we have to hire our first non-founder salesperson, and maybe any potholes that are going to be in the path that I will need to avoid as the said founder?
Yeah, one of the maybe throwaway lines in the book, but I saw it over that first 10 years, and I've continued to see it, is in the beginning, whatever is your weakness is the weakness of the organization. And so, the first person I hired was a bookkeeper. I can't stand to handle any of that stuff. And so we're pretty good at filling in where we're weak. Mm-hmm. But at about 5 to 10 million in revenue, your strength will start to become the weakness of the organization as founder. And that's because you're getting split duties now. You need to really step up as CEO or head of the company. And you're also trying to drive sales. And you're juggling a couple of balls, neither one of them well. And so what you do, you end up hiring somebody junior. Hey, I can kind of watch over that side while I'm being CEO. And it's a cluster. You end up with this. I thought you had it. I thought you. And so you've got really a decision to make. And we say to founders on our FACE tool, choose the box. Ultimately, by the way, if you want to drive valuation, you don't want to end up with any job in the company.
Correct.
If the company's dependent on you, you've just crushed the valuation of your business. If you keep in mind, your job as owner is to drive valuation. But in the interim, you've got to take on some jobs. And I loved an early student of mine, Randy Amon, ran a company called ABL Electronics out of Baltimore. I loved his card. It was founder and head of customer service. The only function of all of them that he had a heart for was the customer service. He backfilled them with CEO and COO and VP sales marketing and all of that. And that gave him a year to fix a major customer service issue in his industry. So that when he then sold his company, at the time they were about 25 million in revenue, he sold it for $1 gazillion to a $2 billion firm who said, look, Randy, if you guys saved yourself millions fixing this mess, it's going to save us 100 million. And so there was no multiple of EBITDA he sold that company for. Side note, he stayed on and just retired last fall as senior VP of customer experience for $40 billion Schneider Electric. He stuck to his strength. And so I think founders have to decide which box they want on our function accountability chart and then fill in. And if they're going to replace their strength, they're going to have to spend more money than they ever thought they would ever spend on someone. And it's like taking on debt. That's where you need some real experience coaching to help you get over those humps.
All right. Final story to bring us home here. So Jim Sobeck, I reached out to him and we were talking through our 400th episode. You were there and he's like, here, let me see what I can do. He made this happen. Would you mind giving us a brief overview of the story that involved Jim Sobeck, Herb Kelleher, and maybe an insight or two from that to take us home?
Yeah, and Jim also told me that you were quarterback at Eastern Illinois, and then till some freshman, Tony Romo. I know all of your listeners know that story, but that was the first thing Jim shared with me when he made the introduction. No, so it was 1995. I'm leading a program for YPO's Southern Seven in Aspen. And that's when Jim discovered our tools. And, you know, he's kind in the article to credit us to go from 10 million to 100 million. And guys like you and others that have helped along the way. And so he and I got talking about the fact that at that event we hosted Herb Kelleher, the great, CEO Legend of Southwest Airlines. And typical Herb, he's speaking Saturday morning and he requires a pitcher of Bloody Marys, as his drink for the morning. And he's smoking in the ballroom, but no one's going to say anything, not even the hotel. This is Herb Kelleher. And the thing that Jim and I shared, and it was the aha, was that, here they're the low-cost airline. I mean, they got started saying we're going to be less than bus fare. And strategy starts with, what is the promise you're going to make? I do want to take a little side note. We've got a client that's in the structural steel business, which is really a commodity. And they said, you know what, we're going to make a different promise. Literally, their tagline is, when you needed it yesterday. And rather than bid on the big major projects, they monitor those who won those projects. And if any of them are going to fall behind, and those penalties can be huge every day that you're late, they jump in as the savior. And by the way, their pricing is whatever the market will bear. These guys are running software-like margins in a commodity business. And so it's all about being clear with the promises. And so their promise was lower than bus fare. And then Herb said they are the most unionized of all the airlines. And that struck all of us. I know there's a lot of firms in your industry. Some are union shops, some are non. I'm involved in the industry. My biggest investment's Barcelona Housing Systems. So I'm deep in that whole space. And Herb laid out why it was wonderful to have that union, because he said, I only had to influence 5 people. And he would drink with them and smoke cigars and all of that instead of 50,000. And the key was, to finish out that story, he said, I found a way to make sure that our interests were aligned. He said, look, guys, I want to grow revenue. He said, number 2, you guys want to grow revenue, which is union membership. So if you'll play along, if we're going to grow based on, and here's our strategy, I will encourage everyone who we hire to join the union. And that's why they've got this, they have different union rules and all the rest do. I can give lots of examples there. But he said, look, I'm going to leverage this as a way to drive alignment in the organization, but we've got to get first aligned at the top instead of being an adversarial. And he was so thoughtful while he's drinking his Bloody Marys and smoking, feverishly
smoking up there
in the ballroom. You got a sense that this guy understood influence how to bring the best out in people, that he is the strategist making that loan decision that nobody else can. And the culture that he built there at Southwest really is what allowed them to execute on that.
Well, yeah, it has me thinking, by the way, I was going to say, you challenged me. You talked about this book, The Goal by Eli Goldratt, which I hadn't read since 2009 in my MBA program. And you talked about it. I went back to read it. And by the way, I had all my old notes. It had my old business card from there. So I got to see what I thought were like the salient points, 15, 16 years ago. And obviously, a lot I've learned, I've grown, but I think that idea of understanding the constraint, and a lot of people would say, how can you even make money in the union market and all these challenges? Listen, if there's a good strategy, you take care of your customers, you hire good people, anybody can come together to overcome some serious constraints like that.
Well, and that's why, Bradley, I want to emphasize it again. I don't care how you feel about Elon Musk. Walter Isaacson's book. First of all, Walter, and I believe him, he has no reason to damage his own reputation. He wrote the definitive book on Steve Jobs as well. Right. He says that Elon didn't get to edit one word, didn't even get to read the book before it was published. So I don't think Walter has no reason to kind of blow smoke up anything. Like I said, I'm on a third read through that. And what I particularly love is Elon's idiot index, how he looks at every one of his companies for where is the thing that is stupidly taking too long or stupidly costing too much. And I want to end on this. I think to the extent that you've got US folks listening to this, as citizens, we should be mad as heck. Elon has put more people and stuff in space in 5 years than all countries combined in 50 years for 1/30th the cost, not for 30% less, for 1/30th the cost, which means we got to know from healthcare to education to government, we have been ripped off by a factor of 30 in this country. And what it means for us as business owners is, and we see it, we all have this kind of slop inside the organization. And the only way Elon finds it is he moves his desk out to that constraint, right, and he sleeps under it if he needs to. But he gathers firsthand intel like Brian Chesky at Airbnb, Laxman is doing at Starbucks as a barista, and my buddy David Risher as the new CEO of Lyft. And so get out of your office and get in the field and hang with the crews and go be on site. And look, no one's going to do it except you. You can't delegate this. This is part of your soul that you can't outsource.
It's a great way to end. Verne Harnish, thank you very much.
You got it, Bradley. Thank you.
All right then, friends, how did that go? Hopefully you enjoyed. Guest number 400, Mr. Verne Harnish. I'm going to be honest, I rambled on for like 17 minutes, I feel like, on the intro. So I think we're just going to close this out. Again, I want to say thank you. I know that there are lots of other high quality podcasts and radio, and Lord knows, a new album from Taylor Swift or Black Sabbath or whatever you're into. I know there are competing places for your attention and your time and your focus. I want to thank you for being here with me. And if you have suggestions to make it better, or suggestions for guests, or ways that we can change to improve, or maybe there's some annoying things that I do, like saying like 100 times in an episode. I'm trying, man. I'm trying to work that out. And I'm trying to get my audio engineer to cut all those out. Anyway, if there's things I can stop doing, I want to know that too. We want a little place in your life, just a little place in your heart. So thank you for listening. Do not hesitate to email us directly at info@bradleyhartmanandco.com. There's 2 N's at Hartman, bradleyhartmanandco.com. You can even just drop that in there if you want to say hi. I promise you, on a long enough timeline, I will respond because we appreciate each and every one of you. That's it. I'm done. You, my friend, you're owed nothing. Deliver value first. Make it a great week.